Prevention to advocacy to mediation to everything under the sun. We're entirely voluntary. Our services are free of charge, and the only requirements for support from our organisation is that you be a child or an adult with a disability to receive our support and our expertise. The organisation was founded in 1994 to promote the human and civil rights of disabled people, not just in the Northwest, but throughout the whole of Northern Ireland. Do I just begin my presentation, or? Okay. We're here also as part of the Northern Ireland Human Rights Consortium. We are supporting the Making Our Future Fairer campaign. There are several hundred organisations, obviously, you'd be aware, who are supporting the Bill of Rights campaign. And one of the questions that you've asked in your survey, is a Bill of Rights important? Do we need a Bill of Rights? We would say a Bill of Rights is not important. We would say a Bill of Rights is urgently required. It doesn't quite state the importance of a Bill of Rights, particularly for people with disabilities. And one of the key reasons for that is post the agreement, and before the agreement, but post the agreement, there was a guarantee given that there would be a Bill of Rights, and it wouldn't just be about the usual two communities and nationalism and unionism and all of that. It would be about broader rights, as the former Deputy First Minister mentioned in his evidence to the committee. It would be about group rights and equality and other rights and experiences of people living in Northern Ireland, and not just the two communities, i.e. nationalism or unionism. And this was an opportunity for us as an organisation to get involved and say why disabled people have a critical role to play. And indeed, we were involved at the very, very beginning when this was first discussed back in the beginning of this century. We were at the forefront of the campaign for the Bill of Rights back then, almost 25 years ago. Why is it important? Well, it's important for a very simple reason that disabled people, disabled children, we don't really have rights. In fact, in a Northern Ireland context, we're not even really considered as human beings, because what we have and what we're classed as being are people with special needs. And therefore, our issues are put in the context of needs. We're seen as resource-based, resource-intensive, and we're not seen in a human rights context, and haven't been here, and in quite a few other countries around the world. Because if you put something in the context of needs and you don't deal with it, then you can say, oh, well, that's not an urgency, it's an unmet need. It's an unmet need, so we're okay, we can, we'll get there, we'll do the best we can, but they're not that important. And of course we couldn't be that important, because if we're not even human beings entitled to fundamental human rights and understood within the context of human rights, how could we be important? And then we had, in the middle of this, 2006, we had the UN Convention on Human Rights. And of course, disabled people all over the world and disabled children, we all got excited because at long last, we were going to be seen as human beings entitled to fundamental human rights. So the issues that we faced on an ongoing basis would be seen for the first time in a human rights context. So we got all a bit overexcited. And then, of course, the UK ratified the UN Convention in 2009, and we had the periodic review of the periodic examination of the UK, which includes Northern Ireland, of their progress on the rights of disabled people. And of course, as you probably are aware, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Committee concluded that there were systemic and grave violations of disabled people's human rights in the UK, and that in terms of the rights of disabled people, that the UK government was going backwards rather than forwards in terms of maintaining those rights. The language of rights, the language of human rights, the idea of human rights for disabled people remains the most critical, because we can be understood as human beings entitled to the same rights as everyone else, on the same level as other human beings. Then we're in the game, and then people will understand why it's so important for people with disabilities to be included. Just to give you an example, we spoke to the former First Minister way back, I think, before the just after the assembly fell. In fact, the day after, we were at the party conference, and we met with the former First Minister, and I said to him, "Oh, we're the Northwest Forum of People with Disabilities. We're a human rights organisation," and he replied, "I thought you were a group of disabled people." So even he acknowledged that disabled people were not human beings and weren't necessarily entitled to fundamental human rights. So, first of all, so it's about recognising that disabled people are human beings and are entitled to human rights, and their issues must be understood within the context of human rights, not within the context of resources, not within the context of unmet need or a burden on society, or people that are always whinging or demanding or moaning for something. We're demanding basic human rights, the same that everyone else has. Now, there's an argument that, you have the European Convention on Human Rights and you have all of those things. That doesn't supplant the idea or undermine the notion that a Bill of Rights in Northern Ireland, specific to the people of Northern Ireland. I apologise, Raphael Nadal's getting a bit excited in the background there. It's my last episode, he's in. So I apologise for the noise. Sorry, because of the noise, I've been distracted now with what I'm saying. But basically, we would like to see our rights included within a Bill of Rights, and our issues understood within that context. Now, people say, well, it's very resource intensive, we're doing everything we can, and we've got equality legislation, out of date equality legislation, 12 years behind England, Scotland and Wales, and their legislation in relation to disability is also out of date. It doesn't meet with the requirements of Article 5, equality and non-discrimination, of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and the UN Committee has made this clear. That was made clear in 2017. The Ecology Commission for Northern Ireland, which is also part of the independent mechanism for the monitoring of the Convention, also made it clear as early as 2009 that our legislation for equality and the human rights of disabled people was not fit for purpose. We're now in 2021, and our legislation is still not fit for purpose. And so a Bill of Rights would address things like that, but it would also address things like, let's look at Social Security and the burden placed on disabled people through the Social Security reform. Disabled people have been thrown into poverty. We, through our own direct experience, know of disabled people who have died as a result of these welfare reforms. Sorry, I was just thinking of Rory, one of the guys that lost his life there recently. But anyway, wasn't expecting that. Apologies. We've known people who have died because of these welfare reforms, where disabled people are being asked to go through a degrading and unlawful process to try and get their basic entitlement to their human right to Social Security. Sorry.
You're 100%. Do you want to take a wee second?
Sorry. I was just thinking of Rory there. That was the guy who lost his life. Anyway, my friend anyway had applied for the benefit, and I told him not to worry. There was a protection mechanism in place, and he would likely be the subject of a paper-based review. And because of his history of mental health issues, he wouldn't have to go through this assessment where you're under interrogation for about an hour, maybe 2 hours, or in some cases a lot less. Where the person sometimes, quite a lot of the time, doesn't listen to you and they're just anxious to tick the sheet. And I said, you'll be okay. But of course, that wasn't the case. He wasn't recommended for a paper-based review, and in fact, he got a letter saying that he would be assessed for PIP, and this triggered his mental health process, and in the long term, it ended with the loss of his life. So it's not just that disabled people are being targeted by cuts in public services and are being thrown into poverty, or that they're now having to beg for their right to social security, or that well, these are all things that have created what's known as a perfect storm, where disabled people have become not just facing inequality, but are going further and further and further outside the fringes of society in terms of their treatment. It's been acknowledged by the UN Committee that disabled people are being treated abysmally, and they should not be the subject and the target of cuts and the abuses by the state party. Now, there are financial pressures on government. There are financial pressures on all of us. We're now in the middle of a COVID pandemic, and very much been felt by disabled people in particular. You'll note the piece of research in England just last week that noticed that 6 out of 10 disabled people have died in terms of the statistics as a result of COVID, and are the most affected group of all the different equality constituencies. You'll note that there is no emergency provision plan. There was no separate emergency provision plan like Australia and Canada, where they, under Article 11 of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, you're required to do an emergency provision for the protection of the rights of persons with disabilities. The initial state report, the UK statewide report, didn't refer to an emergency plan, and indeed the Northern Ireland Assembly's own report into the state report back in 2011 made no reference to it and has no emergency plan for people with disabilities, despite the obvious impacts that an emergency situation, and in this case a COVID pandemic, might have. So we're in a situation where we feel that disabled people's rights, disabled children's rights, have been ignored for far too long. Only this week, in the last 48 hours, a mother was taking her child to hospital who had complex support requirements, and her child was left to wait for almost an hour in soaking clothes for a hoist, despite the fact the parent giving the hospital advance notice. And in the previous March, going to the same hospital, the child was put into a bed that wasn't safe or secure for the child, didn't meet the child's particular requirements, and the child fell out of the bed. The hospital wrote an apology and said they were training their staff and they were going to get a hoist. There's no care plan for that child. There was no coordination, and then they said, and we'll also look to our parents' charity to see about getting a bed for your child. Now there are other children, other adults with disabilities in this situation. The right to have a bed in hospital, the right to be secure in hospital, the right to be treated with dignity is fundamental, and this is why a Bill of Rights is required. Now, one of the things I just want to finish off with is, you're probably aware that Scotland, the Scottish Government, on October the 23rd, and again on October the 26th of last year, announced that they were removing PIP. They announced they were removing PIP because they didn't want disabled people to have to jump through continuous hoops to get their basic income and adequate standard of living and social protection. They said from their 70 disabled persons panels that it was degrading and it amounted to being unlawful. Now, we've argued this before with MLAs, and MLAs have said to us, but we have to think of the block grant, we have to think of parity. There's no guarantee that the Scottish Government system will lead to equality of outcomes. But what they do point out is they follow 7 basic human rights principles. And they focus essentially on the principle of dignity, how we treat people when they need our support and they need our help as a society and a community. And so the methodology could change without breaking parity. And in fact, it's also been drawn to our attention and research that we looked at. We were also part of a disability expert panel, in fact, appointed by one of the members of this group when they were minister. It's also been pointed out by in the research that money could be saved. Huge amounts of money could be saved by removing the private sector involvement in the delivery of PIP work capability assessments if they were made in-house and given the clear responsibility of ministers, and a fortune could be saved in that regard. I'm sorry, I'm going to stop there. I wasn't expecting. I apologise for emotion. I wasn't expecting that at all. Sorry, I apologise.
No, Tony. Look, thank you very much for your account, and there's no need to apologise at all. I mean, you were speaking your own truth, and that was very helpful for us, and moving and powerful, and so appreciate that, and you definitely to apologise. You've given us a very clear account of your own particular thoughts around the Bill of Rights and how necessary it is. I suppose one of the and you referred to it as well, one of the conversations that we've been having with a lot of the experts that have given us advice here is sort of rights versus resource. And, people have made the argument that we can't deliver particular rights because there's a finite amount of money. And my own view would be that that's not good enough, and that we should use the Bill of Rights as an accountability measure to make sure that ministers and governments are doing what they have to for the entire community, and for people that have different life circumstances and don't have equality of opportunity on that basis. And I think that a Bill of Rights would serve to remind governments and ministers of their responsibilities. I wondered if you would touch more on that, if you could.
Well, we're well aware of that argument, but if I could just go back to the social security argument and the Scottish Government, they're keeping the parity, but they're changing the methodology, for example, of how they're doing things. And they're saying that fundamentally the dignity of a human person is the most important, and we have to treat people with dignity. Now, we may not have the resources today or tomorrow for everything that's happening, or the mental health crisis that's happening in our society, or the special educational needs sector, or whatever you want to call it. But when you put human rights in place, what you're telling government and what you're telling society, because it's not just the responsibility of government, when you put a Bill of Rights in place, as the Human Rights Commission have already identified, it's a social contract. It's a contract between the people of society and the government of that society. They would uphold basic human rights. So one of those human rights, if you look at the general principles enshrined within, say, for example, the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, is the right to dignity, and the right to treat people with dignity and compassion. That is a fundamental right, and our current social security provision doesn't provide that. You may not necessarily have to spend any more money to follow the Scottish model. In fact, you could spend less. The argument that you need primary legislation and the issue of the block grant, we've seen the Northern Ireland Audit Office report, we've seen the financial accountability. We're not expecting things to be changed in one day. Well, we have to begin to acknowledge that everyone is entitled to human rights, and everyone, all, as stated in the agreement, equality and respect for all, benefits from human rights. There's nobody that wouldn't benefit from human rights. Most countries in the world have a Bill of Human Rights, whether it's the Bill of Rights in America or countries in Europe. Most countries in the world have a Bill of Rights, human rights. That's a fundamental principle of which society should be judged. It's not based on resources have to be available now. human rights is a gradual process. It's an evolutionary process, and it's about building towards it. It's not about, right, I've got the money, so let's skip the Bill of Rights. We've been meeting on this now for nearly a quarter of a century, since this debate first began at the beginning of this century. And this was something that was agreed in the Good Friday Belfast Agreement, and we still don't have it. Why?
Tony, I think we're on the same page in this, and your testimony there. I mean, coming from your the life that you've lived and the people that you've known, you're making that very clear in terms of a personal experience and what this means. And I think that's key what you're saying there in terms of a social contract, and that this whilst anybody can recognise that at a particular time something might not be doable, that sort of commitment that they want to do it. And I would go further, and I would argue that a lot of the things that we're talking about in terms of rights aren't delivered for political reasons, and that we can always find the money that we need to find for particular things. And to be honest, I don't accept that argument that there's only a finite amount of resources and therefore we can't deliver X, Y, or Z because we prioritise things. So if we prioritise rights and live in a rights-based society, I think it would follow on that people would be treated as human beings. And some of the examples that you've given there, I know that we all probably as MLAs in our constituencies can think of people that are going through some of the examples in terms of people appearing at a hospital and the particular sort of support mechanisms, or the bed or the furniture that they need not being available. Like, I know I definitely have had constituents in circumstances like that, seen with care in the community and care packages and people not being treated with dignity. So look, I don't want to go over old ground. I just thank you very much for your input there. It's really useful, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
I'll go on now to the Vice Chair, Mike, and I can see anybody else wants on there.
Chair, thank you. Tony, thank you very much for engaging with us today. And I'm sorry for your loss. I'm also sorry to hear.
I don't want to. It's not my loss. He was a close friend. He was a very close friend. It's not about my loss, or I'm just living his life as an example where people have lost their lives as a result of these welfare reforms. And it's not just about the absolute poverty and abject poverty that people are facing as a result of the reforms. It's about how we approach that.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to ask you about that because pre-COVID, one of the most frustrating aspects of my work was accompanying people to PIP's appeals. And the experience I had was that the assessors were not taking due regard for people's mental health and capacity. So if you take like that question, can you prepare and cook a meal? A lot of people physically can. They can open a tin and put something on a gas burner, but they don't have the mental capacity to stay with it, and they might wander off. And next thing they're wondering why the fire brigade are at the front door. The assessors aren't, and is that your experience, that there is a terrible imbalance?
There is a terrible imbalance. Some of our members have had a good experience. I myself have had a good experience of the assessment process. I don't want to say that that every assessment that every disabled person has had, but quite a lot of disabled people have had exactly the experience you've outlined, where they don't understand the nature of the disability and they don't understand the particular circumstances. We have to tell our members or clients or people that we support, when they're going in for the assessment, when they're being interrogated about this or being asked whether they can wipe their backside and how do they wipe their backside, and to demonstrate. Sorry, I won't embarrass anybody, but this is what disabled people have to go through. They did that. Well, I'm not going to say that. I'm not going to mention that I lied outside in the bathroom and that the pee's all over the floor, because I want to keep a bit of my dignity here, and we have to tell them that the PIP assessment is not about your dignity. This is about getting you an income to deal with the extra costs related with your disability, and we need you to tell the truth and the absolute truth. This is not a dignified process. In fact, it's the total opposite.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, and I am guilty, I suppose, if you like, of giving that message to people I accompany. You've got to really lay it on, tell the truth. Tony, and you talk about, we can't be doing this based on resource, it has to be based on rights. So it does make me wonder, how are you on this concept of progressive realisation?
The progressive realisation of is something that's common with international human rights law. It's about what steps we take and how we look at the rights that all different constituencies require and how we progress those rights over time. And when you place something in the context of a right and the progressive realisation of a right, what you're saying is, yes, you do have rights. Yes, you are a person entitled to rights. But at the moment, we're going to do this and we might do this. It doesn't quite go far enough, but we're getting there. And it's about being progressive and taking that approach. You've got to remember all these countries that have bills of rights all over the world, and countries that have come through conflicts like ours and our post-conflict societies, like South Africa and so on and so forth. They haven't got it right. They have challenges facing them and resources, but they have a bill of rights which is inclusive of the wider society and the wider community, and that's something that we shouldn't be afraid of.
You said in 2006 you got excited over the UN Convention, only to be disappointed. Could that happen with a Bill of Rights here?
No. No. No, on the basis that at the very least, if disabled people were included and recognised within the Bill of Rights within Northern Ireland, at least they would be seen as human beings with human rights, as opposed to being dismissed as an unmet need or special need. If you're asking me, would the special education school sector have been included in COVID planning had there been a Bill of Rights here, and the key workers and not been included? I would imagine they would have been included. I would imagine that they possibly would have been included, because we would have changed our mentality and approach from a human rights based approach, and we would have looked at those children in the special education sector or in the health sector or adults or whatever within the context of human rights. I would imagine there would be some progress. Maybe not the progress that we're hoping for, but there will be some progress. In relation to the UNCRPD, our disappointment is that of all the states examined by the UN Convention on Human Rights, 88 criticisms were levelled at the United Kingdom. And it was the worst criticised state of all the countries that have are signatories to the UNCRPD, and there was a significant number of criticisms of the Northern Ireland Assembly and the failure of the Northern Ireland government here to adopt its rights. So those were disappointments. But I think if you have a Bill of Rights here, you're developing a human rights culture and a culture of respect and dignity. And I think the ballgame would change significantly, because it's our Bill of Rights. It's specific to all of the people in Northern Ireland. It's specific to the rights of unionists, nationalists, the LGBTQ community, older people, disabled people. If you look at the wider equality constituencies, and you look at women's rights, and you look at ethnic minority rights, you look at LGBTQ rights, and you look at all the list of rights, you will see the only two constituencies in our living here at the moment, older people and disabled people. They're always seen in terms of need. They're never seen in terms of having rights.
Mm-hmm. So the final point, Tony. So a Bill of Rights potentially is not just important in its own right as a document, but to the extent which it might change the culture with which we approach bringing forward legislation.
Absolutely.
Well, listen, I really appreciate your engagement, and we haven't discussed yet where we're going with this, but if we do get it over the line, for what it's worth, I will certainly be arguing that dignity is front and centre of a Bill of Rights.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Meg. I've got Mark indicating, then Paula, then Carol.
Hello, Tony. Great to see you. It's been a while. Thank you, Tony, for that powerful, personal, and pragmatic, which was most unlike you, contribution that you've made today. Just picking up, and I had a couple of questions prepared after reading your submission, but as with every conversation with you, Tony, it's going to go off on a wee bit of a tangent. The weaknesses, I suppose you're being kind, calling them weaknesses that you've pointed in the benefit system are something that we've been flagging up for some time, and I've been firmly of the view and remain of that view that parity doesn't mean or shouldn't mean parity, and we should be trying to do things as best we can here. You've alluded yourself to the competing pressures, on public finance, but even when there's not enough money to go around, there should always be enough dignity to go around, and that has been sadly lacking in many areas, and PUP assessments is certainly one that a couple of members here have referred to in that.
I've lost you.
It's not just you, Tony. I think maybe
Sorry, let me back. So,
it's not.
yeah, Tony, a right few of the witnesses we've heard from take a narrow view of particular circumstances in the agreement to mean identity and cultural rights. And now, I and others actually throughout our deliberations have highlighted how central socio-economic issues were to the conflict here. It's also true, well, you can tell me if it's true, it's certainly accepted that the conflict has contributed to our higher than average proportion of people with disabilities.
Yeah.
Those particular rights of people with disabilities should be included in a Bill of Rights. Would that be your view?
That would be my view, but you also raise another issue because of the conflict here, and because of the ongoing debate, and we're living in a post-conflict society, and nationalism, unionism, it takes up most of the oxygen and takes up most of the mainstream press and media, and with the greatest respect, it occupies the minds of our politicians most of the time because it's the big issue. That means that the equality and human rights issues facing other constituencies, including disabled people, have suffered as a result and have been lost and have been completely absent in the debate. And we were explaining this. We met with the UN committee. We were explaining this to several members of the UN committee and said, well, yeah, but disability would be a high priority. And I said, no, not at all. In Northern Ireland, disabled people will be the least probably priority. We're second-class citizens. And indeed, the equality and human rights agenda generally will be quite low because we're still preoccupied with conflict. We're still preoccupied with post-conflict and the hurting stalemate that results from that. So we're not a very mature democracy in terms of human rights and equality. But when we get a Bill of Rights, and and obviously with your report and what things we could do better, that'll help us bring us forward. And that's true of all post-conflict societies. But we've had now 20 years of the peace dividend, and it's now about time that the wider community and wider society and the particular human rights and experiences, as already referenced by the former Deputy First Minister, your uncle, Mark, in the evidence, that they are addressed. And it isn't just about nationalism and unionism, it's about the human rights of everyone living in Northern Ireland, and not just the two communities.
Yeah, we have to do all we can to push those rights up the table, because when they hover around the bottom of the table in terms of priorities, where they have been, the danger is that they just get relegated. And Tony, are there any particular rights or articulations of particular rights that were in the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights that were particularly important for people with disabilities that we might seek to replicate here?
Well, a particular right, most important, is obviously the right to life would be a particularly good one, and that also means the quality of life, and obviously given the cuts to services, social security, and everything else, an adequate standard of living and social protection, a fundamental human right. We would like to see those particular rights given particular focus, and again I would draw again to the Scottish experience where they've started to change their system, and it doesn't necessarily cost a pile of money. It just means that they're now looking to see how they can treat people with a little bit of dignity and change the process that to one that's less abusive and could possibly result in less poverty and less loss of human life.
Brilliant, Tony. Thank you for that. I'll let you go and sure speak soon.
No problem. Thank you, Mark.
Okay, Mark. We've got Paula next. Paula, do you want to come in?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you very much for your presentation so far. A couple of the issues I was going to raise have already been covered. I just wanted to pick up on that point, and I hope I don't make you upset again. But the issue there about
No, I apologise for that.
No, not at all. But the issue about suicide rates amongst young people, and when I went up to MenCap not that long ago, they were saying that in many ways, the health service are happy to deal with their condition, but they forget that maybe there are poor mental health issues there, and they don't get addressed. And I suppose this might be difficult for you to answer this, but to what degree do you think that a lot of the poor mental health is attributed to that dignity and the societal support that they may feel just generally, and then systemic, which you'd sort of reference there more around possibly access to benefits or infrastructure or other ways that there's just barriers in society that possibly we as an assembly could take down or legislate, like the changing places, the campaign then for better. So I'm just wondering, is it emotional or is it systemic or what, where would we be focused, should be focused on?
The focus, mental health is very much related on your emotional state of well-being, and if you're being attacked from all areas, from cuts to basic public services to cuts to your entitlement to social security or whatever, or the methodology that you have to engage in and go begging for it and go through an interrogation process, whether it's via the work capability assessment or via the PIP assessment, or you're sitting back and you're hoping that the £20 increase in universal credit will remain, because there are many disabled people now who no longer have the economic protections that they once had, because as a member of my board said, they went to the assessment centre and they got cured. They lost that disability overnight because they've lost all their benefit entitlements. Now appeal, they got it back, but they have to go through that process of appeal to get it back, and they have to have the nerve to do it. Many disabled people don't. Many parents of disabled children don't. They think, the initial decision's right, and then they go through this long, burdensome process to get it back. So if you give people an adequate standard of income, but also, you're first of all, you're on your way. But secondly, and more importantly, and this is true of what the young people said on the programme Spotlight the other night, and you're talking about mental health, and they made it clear, and this is equally true of young people and children with disabilities. We have a voice. Let us talk about our own experiences. We are experts on our own experiences. We walk in our shoes. Listen to us, talk to us, support us. Don't dismiss us or have someone else talk on our behalf. And that's very true of children and young people with disabilities generally. But it's doubly true when it comes to children with disabilities. And it's also true when it comes to disabled adults. So it's about making sure that people are listened to and are heard. We, the Northwest Forum, had to go to the UN and argue with the UN to seek clarity on Article 4.3 on the voice of disabled people and children and young people, and how important that was in decision-making processes that impacted on their lives, in particular in relation to young people and people's general mental health and its relationship to how the independent mechanism worked and the role of disabled people in monitoring the implementation and monitoring the convention, because since the UN Convention came in, they had misunderstood the article. Even the independent mechanism hadn't really understood fully the two articles, Article 4.3 and Article 33.3. We went to the UN Committee on behalf of the disabled persons-led organisation sector and said to them, look, we need your help here. We need decision makers, government, we need the independent mechanism, we need all these to understand what these two articles mean, because they're not interpreting it correctly. We understand what it means. And thankfully the UN Committee agreed with our assessment and agreed to put out a general comment, which is a quasi-legal declaration as to how those articles should be. That relates to, in part, to mental health, because if you don't listen to a person and you exclude them and they have nowhere to go and you're not being listened to by decision makers, so they're not getting this opportunity that I'm getting now to speak on behalf of disabled people in my organisation, that's not going to help your mental health. It's going to make it worse. And one of the things we learned the other night from the Spotlight report is young people with mental health issues, they need to talk and they need that support. And that's not just in relation to big decisions or talking to MLAs or talking to chief executives or talking to committees, steering committees like this one. That's in relation just to talking about your own particular circumstances, about what you want, what you feel is right for you, or what you feel is right for your constituency, either in a personal level or in a much wider societal level. So it's about listening to people and making sure that people know that you want to listen, and that it's important, that experience that they're having is important.
Thank you very much. That's great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we can go to Carol now.
Thank you for your presentation. Very, very powerful. So even just going from what you said is that there does need to be a big inclusion of economic and social rights. So that's a given. And the other aspect of it is, even though there may be disability discrimination, it just doesn't go far enough. So there's a definite need to have that inclusion in a Bill of Rights. So I suppose for me, right, a bit like Mark, one of the things I know, even from being in DFC and even Deirdre's approach, that the process of people are being assessed for disability needs to be brought in-house and it needs to be human rights compliant. But in absence of a Bill of Rights, how do you feel? Because that's going to be down to discretion and the personal instincts of a minister. So, I suppose I don't want to put words in your mouth, but basically what you're saying is that this Bill of Rights definitely has to have human rights and equality at its fore for everybody.
Yes.
Okay. And then the last thing I would say is that even this morning, Paula and I were on the Health Committee, and one of the things that concerns me is that there's no full equality impact assessment being done on even the draft budget for health, for example. And it's a screening out exercise. So if there was a Bill of Rights there and a stronger adherence to human rights and equality, then we can't be screened out. We have to be included in.
Yeah. Well, even with, and this is in the you'll know this from your previous position, taken temporary over as minister, you'd asked the different expert panels to consider a range of issues, and we did. You probably know, we were on the forum was on one of the members of the expert panel. Even with inequality impact assessment or screening in or screening out, that doesn't necessarily solve the situation. We just looked at the Department for Communities Equality Impact Assessment that says £1.5 million has been wiped out from the advice sector. What that means to us that disabled people won't be able to apply for universal credit, PIP, or help and support with work capability assessment, because that's where you go to get the free advice. They'll be still hostage to people who will charge them 40, 30, 50 pounds to help them fill in their forms or do whatever. And a lot of the time, these cowboys, as I call them, don't know what they're doing. And then they come to us and they say, I didn't get, that's because you didn't do this, you didn't do that, you didn't do this, you didn't do that, and you need to do this, and you need to say that. And but he didn't say us to do it, or she didn't say us to do it. And I said, well, that's because they're interested in your money, not your entitlement to. So when you take money away and you take the advice sector away to support, whether it's disabled people, whether it's ethnic minorities, whether it's older people, you're taking people's access to income away. The thing that you also said was, you raised the issue of in-house. The Scottish model prioritises the importance of in-house assessments, and says that any assessments in relation to disability benefits should be done only as a form of consultation and only if it's necessary, and that evidence should be got the other way, and that nobody should be put through any undue stress or dignity. The other principle that I suppose the Scottish model uses, and I think you're sort of catching on to this, is ministers taking direct responsibility for how citizens are being treated, and hence how disabled people are being treated, rather than being farmed off, and that's responsibility somewhere else. And they're quite proud of the fact that if a decision is made, the minister takes responsibility for that and stands by that decision, and that high level responsibility. But also, there was a particular principle of economic costs savings, and like Northern Ireland, Scotland have to make savings too on social security, on everything. And when they're competing with resources, they have COVID, they have people in the poverty circumstances as described in Spotlight a few days ago. They have, similar things that we have. And what they've said is, look, if you remove these, if you have in-house assessments, you automatically start saving money. So it's not just about guaranteeing or trying to progress someone's human right to an adequate standard of living and social protection, but it's delivering what government needs from a fiscal point of view. It's saving money.
Yeah, the issue is that, I completely agree. But the reason I pointed out the quality impact assessment was because up until now, Deirdre's the only one who's done it. And what she's pointing out is, if the money isn't found, then these are the services that are going to go. She's not saying she's cutting them, but just to have that in the record. So it's just to be clear.
When you're saying that the Department for Communities is the only department to do an equality impact assessment on reforms, on COVID measures and all the rest, and none of the other departments are...
No, they haven't done it yet. And they should, because the issue is that the reason I'm bringing this up is that when you talk about human rights compliance and the need to have inclusion, then you need to go as far as you possibly can to show, unless you get the proper budget for it, these are the things that are going to be cut, right?
Yeah.
Or these are the things that, and the issue is that when it comes to advice, it comes to welfare, it comes to social protection, it comes to disability, it comes to isolation, benefits and all the rest, they shouldn't be negotiable. That's basically the message in that. Yeah. And that would be the message right across the board. However, the reason I'm raising that is that there is a school of thought that you shouldn't include social and economic rights and ability rights. There is a thought, and even from some of the witnesses we've had up until now, have said things like, "Oh, don't widen it out and don't include everybody because that's not the way to go." So who do you exclude? So which rights do you cherry pick and who's important?
If we want to continue a history of exclusion, of excluding disabled people, of excluding black people, of excluding the LGBTQ community, of excluding older people, and giving them substandard treatment, by all means, exclude. But if you want to think only of nationalism, whether it's under the guise of the tricolour or the Union Jack and the two large communities, a lot of people, I respect people's right to the union, I respect people's right to nationalism, but there's a lot of people in Northern Ireland who are not interested in nationalism or unionism. They just want a bed. They just want dignity for 2 weeks while they're dying. They just want to the possibility of an extra week not having to go to a food bank. They don't have time to think about these wider things that have preoccupied us for the last God knows how long.
And I completely agree. I completely agree. I believe you can't have a full Bill of Rights, and I'll finish on this, Chair. You can't have a full Bill of Rights without economic and social rights within it. Because if you don't build it in, you're just constantly putting people who've been discriminated to the back of the queue or to the back of the bus.
Well, sorry, just to finish off, if you don't include economic and social rights, you're then contrary to the Good Friday Belfast Agreement.
Well, Tony, this case has been in contrary to that for 23 years, so yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. I think that's all the members. I don't see any other indications. So I think at this point, Tony, all that's left is to thank you again for your contribution this afternoon and the time that you spent with us. And I know we've questioned you greatly. I can hear the wee dog in the background there. So thank you very much. Again, that was really powerful and useful. And I just appreciate your testimony, and we'll let you get on with the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. We can now, members, just take a wee second and we can move on to the next item on our agenda. So item number 3 this afternoon is a briefing from Alexa Moore from TransgenderNI. Members might remember that Alexa had written to the committee asking to present. She's a director in TransgenderNI and a trans rights activist that has been involved in human rights now for some time. She was a member of the Youth Forum in the North between 2016 and 2018 and has quite an extensive background in this. And you'll find the sort of briefing paper is the consultation response that Transgender had provided to the consultation that had closed on the 5th of February. So Alexa, I'd like to welcome you to the meeting.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you very much. Look, I'll not go on any longer. Let you begin your briefing. Thank you.
Of course. So just first off, thank you all so much for inviting me in today, and we really do appreciate the opportunity to provide evidence to the committee on this. It's an incredibly important issue for me and for TransgenderNI. So by means of an introduction, my name is Alexa Moore. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm one of the directors of TransgenderNI, which is a human rights organisation which exists to support and advocate for trans communities in Northern Ireland. So we do that in a lot of different ways, things like this, kind of, public consultations, responses, public campaigning and advocacy, as well as individual supports. And we also run a community space for trans people in South Belfast. So we cover all of Northern Ireland, but a lot of our work is Belfast based. I'm going to address a number of issues here today with the committee, starting with our reasoning for supporting a Bill of Rights in Northern Ireland. Seems like a good place to start. We have, since our founding, been strongly supportive of the Bill of Rights as a means of addressing some of the gaps in our, quite frankly, patchwork equality and human rights legislative framework. It's worth noting that we don't view this as a cure-all, as something that has been discussed with Tony. There are many more changes needed to the governance of this region and many other issues to address beyond the Bill of Rights. However, we view such a bill as a starting point for Northern Ireland taking a truly rights-based approach moving forward, and a bill would kind of provide the executive with the framework to kind of pass policy and make legislation in a human rights compliant manner. Something that I feel has been lost in all of the politicking around this process is the context of the Bill of Rights. As Tony said, it was guaranteed in the Good Friday or Belfast Agreement to protect and uphold the rights of all communities in Northern Ireland. These protections are 23 years overdue, and in those 23 years, human rights have gone unfulfilled for so many, as you've already heard. Looking specifically at trans communities, the only adult gender identity service in Northern Ireland has been at a point of crisis for about 3 years now, and the effect on our communities has been monumental. Mental health has plummeted for so many in our communities, many of whom have now been waiting 4 or more years for basic access to healthcare. The treatment of trans people within those gender services has also been incredibly poor, with many of our service users reporting that the invasive processes of these services actually worsened their mental health and in some cases traumatized them. There are some human rights abuses that are specific to overlapping sections of the community. For instance, non-consensual surgeries that are still today carried out to quote unquote normalize the appearance of intersex babies' genitals. The right to non-discrimination and the right to access of healthcare are very clearly not being met for some communities in Northern Ireland. In the area of education, where trans young people have very little legal protection, the Education Authority published research into the LGBT community's experience in post-primary institutions, showing a complete lack of support for trans communities in school. Only 7% of trans respondents said that they faced no challenges due to their trans identity at school, and over 60% said that their teachers handled trans issues badly in classes, with some reporting transphobic bullying not just from pupils, but also from teachers and other school staff. We see such high rates of truancy and underachievement among trans communities in school, and is it any wonder our rights to accessing education are not being met? I could go on and tell you in depth about the fact that trans people also haven't been able to access legal gender recognition in about 3 years. I could talk about the human rights violations perpetrated by the PSNI in their treatment of the Black Lives Matter protesters and racialized people in general. I could tell you about the continued exporting of pregnant people in the event where they need basic reproductive rights, but I feel like I may be belaboring the point. Human rights have not been a concern in the governance of this region over the past 23 years, and it's time for that to change. The second area I would like to address is one that I know has been an area of contention for this committee, and something that was briefly discussed with Tony previously, and that is the inclusion of so-called social, economic, and cultural rights. Firstly, the fact that this is a contentious issue is quite frankly baffling to me. It is imperative that the rights covered under this label, in particular those contained within the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, are enshrined in domestic law, especially in the wake of Brexit and the UK government's agenda of cutting workers' rights, slashing big holes in the safety net that is our welfare state, as again you've already heard, and regressing rather than making progress on human rights. I also want to, on a kind of more philosophical level, I want to object to the notion that we can discuss civil and political rights on one hand and social, economic, and cultural rights on the other, and not talk about how those rights are intertwined and are interlinked and are often inseparable. The right to freedom from cruel and degrading treatment is intricately tied to the ability of someone to have a home, to the support delivered by a social security net, to the ability to access timely and fit for purpose healthcare. The right to freedom from torture and cruel and inhumane treatment is a kind of civil and political right, and then the rest of those are economic, but they're so interlinked you cannot separate them. In Northern Ireland, where we most starkly see the rights to freedom from discrimination, again, civil and political right, being violated, is in the impoverishment of minority communities, high homelessness rates, underemployment, very little access to healthcare, discrimination against disabled people within our welfare state. We can't have civil and political rights without the economic rights. Anything else is nothing more than lip service. On that note, there was a suggestion in the public consultation that the entire bill could potentially be lip service, which was quite worrying. Or as it was put in the consultation, the bill would, quote, set out an aspirational vision based on guiding or foundational values. The wording of this question and the accessibility of the consultation more broadly is something I'll come on to in a minute, but I'd like to hone in on this suggestion first. So when it was raised, we held a workshop with a bunch of our service users, just kind of putting it out to trans folks who were interested in the Bill of Rights or wanted to learn more about it and wanted to respond to the consultation and feed into our response and advocacy on it as well. We asked this question to them, and it was met with almost equal amounts of confusion and anger. Trans people and so many other communities across Northern Ireland are having their rights abused right now, today, and every day. From the issues I've already mentioned around legal recognition and access to healthcare, to the indefinite detention of migrants and refugees in Marne Detention Centre, and the cruel treatment of disabled people on PIP that you've already heard. An aspirational vision of rights is nothing without actionable rights to back them up. Have your aspirational vision as the preamble to a Bill of Rights, but a Bill of Rights with no actionable rights is meaningless. Human rights are not for the future. They're not something we should aim for. They're not something the government should maybe think about potentially upholding somewhere down the line. Human rights are for here and for now. Human rights are for 23 years ago when this bill was agreed in the Good Friday Agreement. There's something we should already be focusing on, already be upholding, already be pushing for. And to pay mere lip service to rights in a bill purported to protect them does nothing for those currently suffering. Coming back to an earlier point, it's incredibly important that the public consultation and engagement on this issue is done in line with best practice and in a way that is meaningfully accessible to as wide a range of people as possible. It's also an opportunity to educate people on where this comes from and on the history of the bill. Reading the public consultation, you would never guess that the Bill of Rights was agreed in the Good Friday Agreement. Context is incredibly important, especially whenever, we have a generation of post-Good Friday Agreement young people kind of growing up and getting interested in politics and getting interested in affecting their society. We need to make sure that they're educated on where all this stuff came from. Accessibility is just as important as well. The wording of these questions, combined with the lack of framing context, led to a situation where, without the wonderful workshops and public awareness campaign run by the Human Rights Consortium, I don't think that this would have reached as many people. Working proactively within the community and voluntary sector, and in particular with young people and those with learning disabilities, to make sure that consultations and engagement are accessible to as many people as possible is absolutely essential for good governance and good legislation. Within the workshop that we held on the Bill of Rights, while a significant proportion of time was spent unpacking those questions, there was also a good amount spent on some particular issues that trans people face in their day-to-day lives. Something that came out very strongly from the workshop is the fact that disabled or neurodiverse trans people feel like their disabilities are being used within statutory services to deny them autonomy, to deny them their identity, and to deny them access to gender-affirming healthcare. The treatment of disabled people generally in Northern Ireland and across the UK is an absolute disgrace, as you've already heard. But when that intersects with other demographics, such as trans identity, for instance, people can run into significant barriers to accessing support and care. Even kind of additional barriers on top of the ones that they already face. Something else that became quite clear from this workshop is that many of our service users have absolutely no faith that this process will result in anything. And frankly, can you blame them? After 23 years, multiple public consultations, and a sickening amount of politicking, it seems as though we are right back where we started. And that's incredibly unfortunate, but I think symptomatic of how this government has run over the past 23 years. The rights of minority communities have consistently been violated. This government and these processes are in and out of a state of political deadlock as well. So, show our communities that you actually work for them and make sure that, this process actually goes somewhere so we can see that human rights are central to Northern Ireland, are central to our future in this region. On a personal level, I'm a 20-year-old trans woman from the border regions who, up until a month or two before I left school, was absolutely desperate to leave Northern Ireland. I've sat and watched as so many of my friends, in particular queer young people, have gone on a plane or a ferry and went off to Britain or further afield to get out of this place. And maybe that was a conscious choice, but the reality is that we are being pushed out. We are being pushed out of homophobic and transphobic schools. We are being pushed out of healthcare. We are being pushed out of employment through discrimination and abuse. We are being pushed out of the public sphere through harassment and abuse levelled at us in the media and even by some politicians. Is it any wonder why so many of our young people choose to leave? Their rights aren't being upheld, so they'd rather go somewhere else. I stayed because I wanted to work to make Northern Ireland a better place for trans communities. Others stayed because they're broke, or they can't get out, or because they've built up a network here, or because they want to be close to family, or because they too see an opportunity to make this place better. The Bill of Rights is not a cure-all, but it could signal a sea change in how Northern Ireland functions and is governed. It could convince some of our young people that this is truly a new approach for a new decade. I would urge you all to not repeat the mistakes of the past and to do everything in your power to ensure a Bill of Rights that offers substantial and meaningful protections for all communities in Northern Ireland. Thank you very much for having me and for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Alexa. That was a useful briefing, and I suppose taken in the round along with the consultation response that you had provided to us prior to today's meeting. It has covered quite a range of topics and a lot of the issues that you feel, and I suppose you can very clearly feel your frustration. And as somebody that obviously is a big representative for the community that you're working within and the people that you're advocating for, that was really useful, and I appreciate that. Thank you. Just in the first instance, there's a couple of things I want to touch on or see if you will expand upon. So you referred there some of the words that you'd used in terms of rights as a framework, rights, a rights-based approach, using rights. I've asked loads of the people that we've had here how they would view a Bill of Rights as an accountability measure. So, we've had some people, and I know you've expressed sort of discontent at the thought that socioeconomic rights are almost pitted against other rights, or this whole thing. And I'd referred when I was asking Tony questions around the sort of rights versus resource argument that I sort of don't put any weight on and think is a sort of a cop-out, to be honest with you, and don't accept. And I know that we've had comments from people who will say that by putting these rights in a Bill of Rights, we're building people's hopes up, and these things might be in a Bill of Rights, but they're never going to be achieved. And I would sort of take the attitude, well, that's not good enough. There's resource there to deliver the things that people want to deliver, and ministers should prioritise rights for everyone because rights are universal. So, increasing the rights of a trans individual or a non-binary person or somebody from an ethnic minority or whatever isn't going to lessen the rights that anybody else has. So I just wonder if you'd delve into that a wee bit more.
Of course, and I mean, I think that the rights versus resource argument is an incredibly important one, and it's one that I think about a lot because whenever we're looking in particular at trans healthcare, that's one of the areas where every time someone's talking about it, it's the gender identity clinics need more money or the gender identity clinics need more staff, and that's sure that might be part of the problem, but it's the entire structure. It's how trans people are treated. It's how trans identity is viewed as a disorder, as a mental disorder. It's framed within that kind of mental health framework. And if you take it out of that and put it into a human rights framework, if you put it into a framework of, for instance, sexual health care provision, or if you bring it down to the GP level and make it a kind of primary care thing, it's actually going to be cheaper. Like a lot of the things that we're advocating for in terms of making trans healthcare more accessible and reducing the invasive and interrogatory process that people are forced to go through, it's cheaper than the way that they're currently doing it, because the way that they're currently doing it inserts these kind of artificial waiting times because trans people are just not treated as though we have the rights and the competence to make decisions for ourselves and for our bodies. And so, I do think that, you're right, Emma, that this kind of resource versus rights argument is a bit of a misnomer. And I don't like the fact that, that economic and kind of economic, social, and cultural rights are pitted against civil and political rights. Because, as I said, and I think we made this point in the consultation response as well, they are so intertwined. You can't have one without the other. And I think that it's important that we don't view this as a cure-all, because we aren't going to have a Bill of Rights and we're going to click our fingers and everything's going to be fixed. That's impossible. There's a million and one things that need to be fixed. But like if we look, for instance, at how the Northern Ireland Executive dealt with lockdown in late last year, and how votes on the coronavirus lockdown were vetoed or blocked by a particular member or party in the executive, and how the right to life and the right to health could just be blocked and kind of ignored like that. Again, having a Bill of Rights would put a framework in place to prevent things like that happening, to prevent these kind of very blatant abuses of human rights from kind of taking hold and going throughout our government. And I think just coming back on a point on that was made with Tony on the kind of EQIAs, the equality impact assessments in Section 75, equality screenings. I mean, anytime we see any of those, it's the vast majority of times it's absolute nonsense. They just haven't, it hasn't been done right. It hasn't, they haven't looked properly at the actual impact that a policy is going to have on minority communities, or they haven't considered minority communities at all in the policy because, oh well, it's just a general policy, it's going to benefit everyone. And I do think that this laissez-faire attitude to rights and to protecting marginalized communities in the kind of governance of this region, it does need to change. And I think that a Bill of Rights would be a good start.
Thanks, Alexa. I mean, I can't disagree with anything that you said. I suppose I just want to, and I know you've referred there to the problems at Brackenburn, and that's one of the things that I've been bringing up as well. I feel that sometimes that, not to rehash, but that resource argument is used when it's actually a political decision. So you made reference to, women's healthcare at the minute and how the legislation hasn't been properly enacted in the North. The same with the gender identity services. And I think something that you touched upon there in terms of the percentage of young people that will experience, transphobic or homophobic bullying, even in schools and from teachers and from people that are supposed to be caregivers. And I always think when you decriminalise something, or you criminalise something, or you change legislation, that in that instance makes the thing illegal or legal, or sets at that stage a law around a particular thing, but it takes some amount of years and usually a number of generations before you will see that particular mindset embedded in within society. And the example there that I would always look to is, like, if you look at the Deep South in America and the end of Jim Crow and segregation, we're still having racist incidents in current times in America because those attitudes haven't all been properly eradicated. And I think it's the same thing now when you're talking there about the fact that the law, and we don't have a rights-based approach, we don't have it set down as a standard that people who identify as trans are equal and entitled to the healthcare that they need or want, or and are treated as if they've got a mental health problem, as opposed to being treated the way they want to be treated. It facilitates that bullying and that discrimination at a local level, or tells people that it's normal and that's fine to hold those views and to voice them when they want to. So I don't know if you've got comments around that. That's me. I just want to thank you again.
Absolutely. No, I mean, so just kind of on the school experience, and I think that this is another area where a Bill of Rights will be incredibly useful, because trans people have so we're protected under our sex discrimination regulations. So the sex discrimination, gender reassignment regulations, Northern Ireland Order, that doesn't apply in schools. So you've got a bit of equality legislation that protects trans people's rights to access goods, services, and facilities in most other areas of life, but it doesn't apply in schools. And this is what I mean whenever I'm talking about a patchwork equality legislative framework. It is literally patchwork. There are people falling through the gaps, and entire swathes of communities that don't have rights, and especially when you're looking in places like education. And I think that it's quite stark when we think about mental health rates in the community, because we deliver a lot of training to a lot of service providers and healthcare workers and stuff like that. And I mean, some of the stats that we give are quite stark and quite upsetting in some cases. I mean, across the island of Ireland, trans people of all ages, around 42% will attempt suicide at some point in their lives. And if you're looking specifically at under 25, that rises to 48%. So we have a very specific issue with trans young people in school being abused, being discriminated against, being bullied outside of school as well. Having negative experiences with their family or being stuck in a kind of hostile living environment. This has a real impact on people's mental health. It's not the trans identity that causes the mental health issues. It's the fact that our society simply is not built to support those communities at all.
Thank you. That point is well made and heard. Mike, I'm going to let you in now.
Okay, Chair, thank you. Alexa. Those, suicide and mental health, poor mental health rates in the trans community are utterly shocking and so out of kilter with the rest of society. And the rest of society has shocking rates of suicide and poor mental health. So just want to acknowledge it. And actually, you said early on, a Bill of Rights you saw as a starting point. So it's the same question I asked Tony. Do you think that not only is a Bill of Rights important in itself, but it's important as a sort of engine to drive a cultural change at the Assembly and in the Executive into how we do business, how we bring forward legislation, and indeed, as you say, even how we conduct equality impact assessments?
Absolutely, and I mean, I think that if we look at the history of the governance of Northern Ireland over the past, kind of 23 years, it is, this isn't an original point, it is very orange and green. It is very, kind of divided along that axis, rather than being, maybe divided along the axis of human rights or protecting communities or providing services or whatever the case may be. I do think that, I say that it's a starting point because I mean, I can think of, 20 different other pieces of legislation that I would personally pass if I ran the country, not just a Bill of Rights, because, it does provide that framework. It does provide that lens through which to view legislation, that lens through which to view policy change in terms of human rights, in terms of the impact it's going to have on the rights of individual communities and on the rights of people in Northern Ireland as a whole. And I think that, while we will still have a very, very long way to go, even if we do pass this, I think that one, yes, it'll have that cultural change. It'll send a signal to people in Northern Ireland that, okay, this is an actual change. This is an actual, a meaningful difference to how we are going to do governance in Northern Ireland. And I think and I hope that if this does pass and if, the kind of public awareness and public education around it is good enough that, we might even see just a change in how people engage with politics, how people engage with legislative change, and how willing people are to get involved in that side of things. Because I know so many young LGBT people who would love to get involved in politics, but are just so intimidated by the orange and green nature of it all, by the kind of the back and forth hostility of it all, and the fact that just the legislation that is currently being passed and policies that are currently being pursued are just not in line with human rights in a lot of different cases.
Okay, I think you've cleared up my concern about aspirational content. You're not against it per se, but you're saying that belongs in the preamble and it has to be accompanied by what's the current phrase? Granularity.
Absolutely.
In the body of the text, yeah.
Oh, 100%. I do think that, there is a place absolutely for kind of a vision of where we're going, an aspirational vision. I do think that it's nothing without those concrete rights to back them up. And I think that the general public and especially minority communities if we have that preamble without the concrete rights, I think it would be a bit of a slap in the face, to be honest.
Yeah, well, I would agree, but I think preamble, it sets out a vision and also rationale explains why we're doing what you're about to read in the main body. Makes sense. Finally, Alexa, any Bill of Rights internationally that you point to that you think is a sort of template for us in terms of rights for transgender LGBTQ plus community?
So I included a little bit in our consultation just with regards to the different UN treaties and conventions and committees that have basically passed motions and stuff like that on kind of recognizing SOGI-esque is how it's referred to in international human rights. It's sexual orientation, gender identity, expression, and sex characteristics. So kind of expressing that SOGI-esque is included in their individual conventions. So that is, I think it was CRPD passed that. It was CEDAW as well, and a few others. I mean, we would recommend that essentially the wholesale importing of those conventions and the International Covenant on economic and social and cultural rights and the civil and political rights as well. I don't necessarily, we don't have like a specific template in mind. And I mean, this is one of the areas that I think that we actually need to be pushing the ball on. I think that in this area, in the area of gender recognition and in the area of trans healthcare, Northern Ireland actually has an opportunity to not just kind of follow the Ireland or the rest of the UK or other parts of the world. I think we have an opportunity to lead other parts of the world in this area, and co-developing this and co-designing this with the minority communities that are going to be meaningfully affected. Will create legislation that is fit for purpose and inclusive of all communities.
Excellent, thank you. So I know you're big into the youth forum there. They're launching a mental health kit in half an hour. Looking forward to it.
Absolutely, yeah. No, I was a member for 2 years in my younger years, but yes, no, they're doing excellent work.
Yeah, no. Alexa, thanks very much. Take care. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, Mike, I've got Paula and then Carol indicating. So, Paula, if you want to go.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you, Alexa. That was really, really great today. I have to say, I've never heard the issue of trying to separate civil and political from socio-economic rights put so well in terms of you just can't. It's like they're so intertwined, and I thought that was excellent the way you put that forward. Yesterday I was on the Rainbow Project's website looking up something, and as you know, if you go to a website they need to spot other things you look in, and one of the pages I came across was a trans swim event, and when you read the testimonies for the people who go to it, they were so powerful. They were like, I haven't put on a swimsuit since 1998, and and you just don't realise how marginalised trans people can be. And I was just wondering, sort of reflected in many ways, this is probably women 40 years ago who were walking down the street without a wedding ring on, pregnant women, or gay men walking down the street holding hands and stuff. And I wonder how much you think that specific mention of the transgender community within a Bill of Rights for Northern Ireland would really move us on as a society in terms of acceptance and even just inner peace for people within the transgender community.
Oh, 100%. And I mean, that the trans swimming event that's run by the Rainbow Project is honestly one of the best initiatives that has come out of the LGBT community in a long time. I really do think it's excellent. And I mean, I miss the sea myself. I miss swimming. And I know so many people who just haven't been swimming since they come out as trans, because of that feeling of the, the lack of safety or the lack of comfort in those spaces. I do think that across the UK and across these islands, generally speaking, the way our legislation talks about trans communities, the language that is used within our legislation, and the focus on gender reassignment and gender identity disorder, and all of these transgenderism, all of these different really outdated and specific terms, I do think does a lot of harm to trans communities, and does a lot of harm to people just trying to understand what their rights are under these particular bills. I do think that having a specific inclusion of trans people, not like in section 75 where trans people are included under men and women generally, having us specifically named, again, it's not a cure-all. It's not going to fix the community's distrust or often disinterest in the kind of political climate in Northern Ireland, but it will go some way to making us feel like, oh, actually, we do have rights in Northern Ireland. We do have something that we can fall back on. We do have a means by which to challenge abuses of rights. And I think that is a really important symbolic and material kind of gain. I really do. Yeah, no, I think it would be a boon to the community.
Thank you. And just the second question was in relation to access to healthcare. Alexa, you mentioned there, used the word evasive processes, and I just wondered if you could elaborate on that and in the context of how a Bill of Rights could influence it, and the sort of connectivity between the two premises.
Absolutely. So, I mean, the Tony before me talked a lot about human dignity and respect and integrity going through these kind of statutory processes in terms of applying for PIP or anything like that. And I think this goes more widely than healthcare. Trans rights and disability rights have such a kind of interconnected and intertwined history, and we often talk about them in the same frameworks. Because in the gender identity services in Northern Ireland and across the UK, we see trans young people under the age of 16 being asked about their sex life, about their sexuality, about their masturbatory habits, about all of these horrible and invasive questions that in many cases just have absolutely nothing to do with someone's trans identity. And that continues into adult services as well. There's we often hear of people having a gender identity clinic suit or a gender identity clinic dress that they wear to basically, tick the box for the clinician to show that they're living in role as a trans person. And I think that the kind of right to dignity and integrity and respect that could potentially be included in a Bill of Rights would again, give us a tool to advocate and say, okay, actually this isn't right, and it's not just immoral, but it's potentially in breach of human rights if we're able to make that case, because we can make that case now and they can say, oh well, too bad. There's no there's no legal obligation placed on kind of gender services or any other statutory services in terms of protecting and upholding trans people's human rights. I think if we do put that obligation on statutory services and on the executive, I think that we will see a bit of a change in terms of how trans identities are viewed, how trans lives are viewed, and how trans people are consulted on our own healthcare, on our own issues. We see a lot, and it's a similar issue to what Tony was mentioning previously in terms of other people advocating for us, cis people, non-trans people advocating on our behalf and saying what they think trans communities need. We know what we need. We are experts in our own care. We are experts in our own human rights. And making sure that that kind of co-design and co-development processes are enshrined in how the government works is absolutely essential.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Paula. We've got Carol and then Mark.
Hi, Alexa. Very interesting presentation, very thought-provoking, but also very welcomed because white people are converted now to the idea of rights around economic and social justice. I welcome that, but that wasn't the case. And just to say that, our assembly was down for 3 years over the lack of human rights. And I know you know that because you were very active in the campaign around having rights addressed. But the issue is that unless there is a clear written into law that it's not equality for some, it's equality for all, and that equality legislation needs to be in the base of rights or in the Bill of Rights, then we're going to be repeating problems of the past. I have no questions. I think I just want to give you that by way of comment. I think your presentation, along with Tony's, not only was powerful, but also it just sang. So thank you, Alexa.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate the comments.
I'll just come in there then, Alexa. Here, I hope you're well. Thank you again for that presentation. Members have been very impressed by it, and I'm no different in that regard. Paula has sort of touched on this issue, but would you advocate for a Bill of Rights to have rights specific to trans people, or is it your position that trans people would benefit from the swathe of rights discussed as a minority group?
I think that, I think both. That trans people will absolutely benefit from just having a Bill of Rights there. I do think that, certain minority and marginalised communities do need to be named in a Bill of Rights, and just making sure that, this applies to all, that there is no exception in terms of who this Bill of Rights applies to. They're all the same rights. We all, kind of making it clear that we all have the same rights. It's just that, it is absolutely unequivocally applying to all of these different groups. Because I think that, there's been an attempt in Britain in the past number of years to exclude trans people from equality legislation, and to kind of roll back on the rights kind of achieved by trans rights activists in the past. So I think that, naming it specifically, naming our communities in that, it would be a good thing.
And just now that you mention the legislation in Britain, you had said, I think, that equality legislation related to trans pupils in schools in Britain doesn't apply here. What is that specific legislation, and have there been any cases here in the north of a trans pupil maybe challenging the school's treatment through the judicial review grounds mentioned?
So as far as I'm aware, there's been no judicial reviews on this particular issue. I think what I was referring to there was, so in Northern Ireland, trans people's rights to access goods, facilities, and services is contained in the sex discrimination regulations. That's basically, we don't have an Equality Act. We have that and a few other bits of patchwork equality legislation. And many of those bits of legislation don't apply in schools, basically. Section 75 that doesn't really kind of come into action in schools. And so what that means is that there's essentially a gap in rights for trans people and for LGBT communities more broadly. There's no legal obligation on schools to provide support or equality of access for those peoples. And so hopefully, again, I don't envisage a Bill of Rights being the cure-all for this stuff. I do, however, think that it will push us towards a place where rights are for everyone and everywhere. There aren't exceptions.
And you mentioned in your submission underemployment among minority communities here, including, of course, the trans community. Of course, we do have here legislation to protect against employment discrimination. Whether or not that's enforced robustly enough is a different question. But how might a Bill of Rights, I don't know if it's fair to address this question to you, Alexa. It's certainly something I think we as a committee will need to consider, though. But how might a Bill of Rights address underemployment? And I just wonder how someone might bring a case on that in the future.
So, well, from my perspective, I mean, some of the most important rights that should be contained in a Bill of Rights are workers' rights. The rights to safety in work, the rights to form a trade union, the rights to, kind of organise and ensure that your workplace is an inclusive place, a place where you feel safe and you feel supported, and you feel able to, for instance, challenge discrimination against you, or challenge, when members of the public are discriminatory or abusive. Because a lot of the times it is actually a public thing. It's an issue of interactions with the public, and the discrimination that may come from that, and trans people not feeling like they'd be able to challenge that, or else they'll be fired. And the lack of unions and the lack of kind of organized workplaces is a massive concern in a lot of places, where trans people can, there is technically employment discrimination legislations,
Yeah.
but for instance, if a trans person is getting misgendered, or kind of experiencing transphobia from members of the public every single day, and having poor mental health, and maybe not being able to come in as a result of that, that's obviously going to lead to disciplinary action, or them being fired, or whatever the case may be. So it isn't necessarily every case isn't necessarily something that could be challenged
Yeah.
in terms of discrimination. However, it's about, kind of, again, as has been said multiple times, creating that culture, making sure that those rights are kind of enshrined,
Yeah, understood.
and are very clear, so that people know when and where they can challenge, where they feel like their rights have been abused.
No.
Again, not a cure-all, but building towards a Northern Ireland that is better for everyone.
Yeah, and I think that's what we all want. So thanks a million for that, Alexa. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, I don't think. Can you hear me? Oh, sorry, my mute button it's not flashing up. Okay, I don't think we've got anybody else indicating. So I think at this stage, Alexa, I can just thank you. You've been put through your paces there and answered quite a few questions. So just thanks again for joining us this afternoon, and for your contribution to the meeting, and to your work. And you've given us a very meaningful and good presentation. So just thanks again. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll let you go on.
Thank you, Alexa. Thank you.
See you later. Bye, folks.
Take
Thank
care.
you. Okay, members, we can now just carry on with the rest of our meeting. So the item on our agenda is Chairperson's business, which we don't have any this week. Number 5, we've got our draft minutes. If members are content with the minutes of the 11th of February as they're currently drafted.
Great.
Yeah, don't see any dissent. Then matters arising. We've got no matters arising this week. Can I direct members then to item number 7, correspondence? We've got the correspondence memo at page 37. You'll find a letter from Conor and Gaeilge, who have asked us if they can present evidence in session to the committee. So if everyone's agreed with that, we can invite Conor in. Yeah. Happy days. And so then we have number 8, our forward work programme. We'll see, we don't have that many meetings left, but we've got quite a few presentations coming up, so we're still continuing with the work. If everyone's happy with that, yeah.
Agreed. Yeah.
Happy days. So then, any other business at number 9? If anyone has anything that they would like to raise.
No.
Shaking heads, brilliant. That lets us go on to the date, time, and place of the next meeting. So we've Thursday the 25th of February at 2 p.m, same time, same place for using your respective ones. And I'll leave it there. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you, Charlie. Take care. Thanks, Emma. Take care, everybody.
This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29. This is the Northern Ireland Assembly Committee Room 29.